Dwayne was on such a roll that we've actually got ourselves to the appointed time for the panel. I wasn't going to interrupt that flow. So what I'd like to do is invite Antony Walker, Richard Bean and Ross Patterson up to the panel, and I want you all to look closely to see if Ross has got a raised eyebrow or not. Whilst we're waiting for the panel to assemble, do you want to take a seat at the end, Dwayne? You can have your watch back too, otherwise I'll steal it. I just thought I might read to you a little item from New Zealand, sorry, the National Business Review that has just come through. This is an update as of 3:30 p.m. New Zealand broadband might not be up to snuff, but we have the best spin doctors. Quote, essentially the situation with Mr Fry this morning was a misunderstanding, unquote, a telecom spokeswoman told NBR this afternoon. He was downloading and uploading large video files on a residential data plan that was unsuitable for his requirements. It had been set up by the existing occupants of the house and only had an average data limit, she said. As a result, Mr Fry had exceeded the data allowance, and so his speed was throttled. So his comments were in reference to throttled speed rather than actual broadband speed. This morning we spoke to the account holder and got the house on a plan much more suited to his needs. And I understand everyone is happy with the new situation. However, his subsequent tweets indicated Mr Fry, who arrived in Wellington this week for a role in Sir Peter Jackson's The Hobbit, was not 110% happy with the way things are done in God's Own. Quote, I think Comcast-style throttling is for the economy. It's disastrous for visitors, for everyone, the actor tweeted, adding, yes, Kiwiland is remote, but if Avatar can be made here and New Zealand wants to keep its rep for being the lovable, easygoing, outdoorsy, yet tech-savvy place it is, then pressure at Telecom NZ into offering better packages, unquote. The data caps that accompany New Zealand landline broadband plans are unusual in the developed world. In most countries, all-you-can-eat data is the norm. Mr Fry also seemed to be caught on the hop by capped upload speed. The actor seems more acclimatised to faster DSL connections or fibre that allows top speed in both directions. So Dwayne, as you were talking, a real live customer was sharing his experiences. Stephen Fry, if you don't know, is an actor and host and comedian from the UK, and one of the shows he hosts is a show called QI, and I can't remember what it stands for. Quite interesting. And so I'm wondering whether on the next episode, when they make the next series of QI, whether we'll have a session on broadband speeds. So we've now got our panellists assembled, Dwayne, Richard, Ross and Antony. And look, I'm going to really be cruel to Ross and say, is there anything from that last session that you thought, you know, I should comment on that? Or are you going to sort of take the courteous route and let us move on?
I'll just raise my eyebrows.
You'll just raise your eyebrows. Okay. Look, I think there's some fascinating stuff in there. The convergence issue is I think the ultimate one here, and I don't know if we ever really get the convergence issue across in sort of its non-tech speak way, but a lot of these presentations did. And I'm trying to figure out how to get there. I suppose the question is, what are the things that you think distinguish the telco mindset from the broadcasting mindset? How do telcos and broadcasters think differently? And you all actually have touched on this in the way you've talked. So I'm actually looking for you to see if you can come up with it.
Well, I think the first thing that we have to know is that telcos don't know a hell of a lot about broadcasting. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because there's two ways to look at it. And I look at it the way this University of Minnesota professor looks at it. His name is Andrew Odlyzko, if I'm pronouncing it right. And he says we can talk about content being king or connectivity being king. He says connectivity is king. All right, and basically, if you're a telco, what you want to be doing is you want to be driving the most intense use of your networks as possible. And if you end up in the content side of the business, now you're trying to ride two horses. You're trying to kind of, you're not sure whether you want to, kind of prop up your content side of things, or if you want to be driving things to the connectivity side of things. And he's very much in favor of the connectivity as king business. In Canada, we had experience between 2000 and 2006 when our dominant telephone company moved into broadcasting and made an utter hash of it and left in 2006. Another one of those kind of convergence implosions. 4 years later, it decided for some reason that it had kind of found its wisdom and now knew about the culture of broadcast production and has gone back into the business. In my view, it's a bad idea.
Anthony? Ross?
Perhaps just to, when we talk about broadcasting, I think what we're really talking about for internet is video on demand. And video on demand isn't broadcasting, so broadcasting is covered in New Zealand under different legislation, but the video on demand, which is what internet users want, is really what we're talking about in this debate.
Yeah, well, Richard, how would you respond to that?
Well, broadcasters are very different.
He's worked in both.
I used to work, I worked in both. I haven't ever worked in a big telco, but broadcasters don't, in my experience, understand telcos at all. I imagine telcos don't understand broadcasters at all either. They just want to buy them. And I think you need to be careful about what you mean by convergence. Mostly people mean it's the delivery of all this stuff all in the same way. It's the IP, everything becomes an IP, becomes a packet, right? It's not that telecommunications equals broadcasting or telcos become broadcasting companies. It's not that kind of, that's not what convergence is.
No, it's not. But I'll come back to it. Anthony?
Yeah, this morning's session I thought was really, really good because it captured just how diverse, how dynamic this whole process of convergence is. And one of the reasons I really love my job is you never meet anybody who knows it all. You never meet anybody who's got all of the answers, who understands what's happening in these markets. This is hugely dynamic, hugely competitive. The idea that one company can know it all, can work out how to deliver, what consumers are looking for, what the economy is looking for, I think is just kind of nuts, really. So I really worry when you get these conglomerates and this idea that somehow one company can deliver this kind of complete package. Everything about the last 10 years has been saying openness. It's been saying, it's been all about open platforms, and that's where the really exciting stuff comes from. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some products and some services that require some collaboration between the content guys and the network guys. And there are some serious questions about how that works and what impact those kind of deals and those relationships have on the rest of the infrastructure. So I kind of struggle with the question a little bit, but I do worry when you see one or other thinking that they can play the other guy's game.
I mean, the reason I go to that is because the broadcasting model is so historically the one-to-many model. And the telco model is, of course, the any-to-any model. And if you go through the history of telecommunications, and even Theodore Vail back in 1913 or 17, whenever, espoused the phrase universal service for the first time. It wasn't actually about everyone getting the phone cheaply. It was about anyone who had a phone being able to talk to anyone else who had a phone, because you had little pockets of telephone companies in North America. And a lot of the conversation we've had today for me has been, if you like, this ongoing tension between the broadcasting model, which is, me to them, and a telco model, which is, any to any. And ultimately this sort of question which says, hey, the environment only really works if all the content's available to all the players, but the content guy somehow or other wants to, is still in a control mode. So it's for me, it's at that human communication model level, rather than the technology level, there's a if you like, a disconnect between the way one lot thinks and the way the other lot thinks. That's by the by. So look, it's interesting in the course of this though that we've had a lot of conversation that said it's about video that's going to drive all of the uptake. Do you see any specific changes that need to emerge to drive video in this country, apart from the bit that Dwayne's already said about, which is kill Sky?
Especially the one at the end of the table.
I didn't mean that, Dwayne.
I think Dwayne's point around bandwidth caps. I think I wouldn't argue that there's no place for bandwidth caps, but it all depends on how low they're set. Ideally, you do want to be able to sort of calibrate actual use with what people are paying for. That would make sense. But what you don't want to be in a situation where you're constraining people. You want to be lifting them up. You want to be bringing them with you. You want to be getting more use and more money running through the system. So if that's if that's not right, then you are going to have a problem, because you're going to be restricting the amount of take up. And when you think about ultra-fast broadband, I think that's an issue.
There are some technological issues associated with this as well, aren't there? If on a wireless network, you're going to have capacity problems, which you may not have on a fibre network. If you've got ubiquitous fibre to the home, it's quite a different question from if you're selling and trying to manage a wireless network. You're going to want to control. You're going to want to throttle some people. You might need to use data caps, peak and off-peak and that so on, to efficiently run a network.
It's interesting you should say that, because the company you and I both worked for after you left, but before I had, which was a wireless broadband provider, actually introduced a wireless broadband plan that had no cap, and created great consternation inside the firm when they did it. But their faith was built around one thing, which is that actually once people experience no cap, they actually download less. And it actually proved to be true. People sort of download to their limit, and especially in the big fat plans in Australia, they're downloading content, especially peer-to-peer movies, that they are never going to watch. But they download because they've got that capacity and they're goddamn going to use it. But when you give them an unlimited capacity, the first month they say, I'm going to use all this, and then they sit back and say, hang on, I can get it any time I want. I'm never going to run out. I don't need to do that. It was quite a fascinating set of curves to see this usage that went through the roof the first month you got unlimited, and then just came back down to around about where they'd been, irrespective of the fact they now had an unlimited plan. It was a really, really interesting piece of work. Okay, look, I've spoken a bit for a while now. Do we have some contributions from the floor on? I thought we would. I've got Bronwyn. I'll go to the gentleman at the back there in the middle. Can you all see the person who's speaking? It's the other side. The other side is coming. Okay.
Hi, Josh Bailey at Google. So I just want to go back to the previous presentation. I really admire your forthright presentation there. But regarding access to data, I noticed you cited MLab. So MLab is one of my projects at Google. And I'd love to talk to anyone here about facilitating more access or maybe more tools running on there. Because we have, among other things, as well as bandwidth tests, net neutrality tests, application kind of level tests. And it's not just me, there's my friends here at TrueNet here somewhere as well that do this, particularly in New Zealand. I think it'd be great to see a continuing analysis. Thanks.
Sorry, I don't know if that was the microphone or me.
Yeah. My ears suck, but yeah, I didn't quite get it.
Could you speak slower?
That's okay, I'll come talk to you later.
Okay. I'm sorry, it was... over here, Bronwyn.
Bronwyn Howell, the New Zealand Institute for the Study of Competition and Regulation. Interesting points there about concentration, but the reality is New Zealand is a small country. We only have 4.4 million people here. The three-firm concentration ratio in every significant industry in New Zealand exceeds 85%. So why we think we can possibly do better than that in the IT world is interesting. I think that's a reality we have to deal with. The other issue is regulation has some positive benefits, But also in a population of only 4.4 million, the limits to regulation have to be taken into account with the scale of the country, and it doesn't always need the regulation costs, and we have to look at some trade-offs at some point here, which perhaps begs the question that some of the remedies that apply in very large countries aren't necessarily going to be as cost-effective in a small country like New Zealand. For example, the fixed cost of separating telecom in the 2006-7 functional separation would have delivered the equivalent of 15 months free broadband for the million broadband consumers we had at that time. And I think that's an interesting tension that we have here, that perhaps means that there are limits to some of the application of models from other places, and I'd be interested in your views on that.
Okay.
Dwayne?
Well, I hear the same argument in Canada, right? So I measure media concentration in Canada, and New Zealand and Canada share the same situation before I got on the scene, which is that there's no data whatsoever, right? And so we don't even know what the trends are, all right? And so what I would like to see in New Zealand is what I've started to do in Canada, is to measure trends over time. I started in 1984, and I've mapped out every single sector of the telecom, media, internet industries. And then you can see whether things are getting better or worse, right? It was hell for me to put together 1 year snapshot, all right? And what it does show is that there are very high levels of concentration. I think I can see from the telecommunications, your monitoring report, that in certain areas there's been some decline, okay? So that's fine. But I didn't have a complete data set. But I think just the fact that they are so, like these are not in the range of like, it's questionable. These are like off the charts.
Hang on, sorry, you can't talk without a microphone. It's not allowed.
To put it in context, we've had no new introduction of a new significant player into the New Zealand telco market or the media market in the last 12 years.
Well, this is my problem. This is.
Do we have Ross? Do you want to, or Antony?
I think this point's quite interesting actually, because actually the market concentration situation is pretty similar in the UK. I mean, we've got 4 major ISPs with probably high 80% of consumers. I wonder whether the focus shouldn't be more on the outcomes than the market concentration point.
I could show, if we go back to my presentation, the UK situation is actually in the middle, right? UK, there's a bunch of countries bunched up in the middle. The UK, US, and Canada in the middle. Finland down at the bottom. New Zealand and France kind of right up at the top. So UK is far less concentrated here, because it also does, it talks. You have to look at the dispersion of market share amongst the players, right? And so when you look at the dispersion of the market share, what you find is that each of the players in the market, let's say there's only 4 players in the UK, right? But if those 4 players, one of them has, say, 46% of the market, and that's the old incumbent. Another one has 25, another has 20, and you know what I'm trying to get at. Versus one has 70,
yeah.
And then that's a huge difference, right? And so it's the structure, it's the composition, right? And so these things need to be addressed, I think. I would like to have the data to be able to do it too. I just think it would be a good idea.
I have a comment on data. Can I also just give you another piece of information from Australia that you might find interesting? We've had a couple of conversations about the way various large media players have worked. In the UK, we've now got the BBC building a U-View out of the back of iView, sort of a coalition to share content. You made reference to the fact that here Sky has been signing up broadband providers, but there was a regulation in the CRTC that said they had to do it by channel. The Australian situation has been quite interesting in this one as well, because we had 2 pay TV providers, only place in the world that built HFC past 3.3 million people twice. Doesn't add to competition, folks, I can tell you that from experience. In the end, Optus and Foxtel, having fought vigorously for content, figured out that they were each offering the customers half as good a service as they could be, and they would be far, far better if they offered everyone all the content. Surprise, surprise. When they reached the deal to share their content with each other, the Foxtel Optus sharing deal, to get it across the line with the ACCC, the agreement was that they had to make the content available to anyone else who owned infrastructure. Now, that meant the small pockets of HFC and various things that we had in other places in Australia. But an interesting part of that deal was that the channels had to be offered in the same packages as they are on the Foxtel piece. And unfortunately, in this secretive world, they did put together a submission for the ACCC that argued the economic case for why bundling like that was important. But unfortunately, like so many things, it was a confidential submission, so we can't see it. I keep threatening to FOI it to see if it's available now, because it's now 8 years old data, but I'd love to see the economic argument why letting people buy channels one by one is not a good outcome. Sorry, that was me extemporising for a second. A lady at the front here. I'm trying to go for new hands first, so microphone man? And I've got a man over there. Just thought of the different model.
Hi, I'm Merja Mölulahti from AUT. I'm actually quite interested into here. We've been talking a lot about the content here, that content is a driver and video demand. I'm actually quite interested in to know, in your visions, who is actually in the future doing the content, and who's actually guaranteeing the quality of the content. I think that's a quite relevant issue.
Could I ask you a question? Who do you think guarantees the content now?
Who guarantees the content
Who guarantees
now?
the quality of the content now?
I think you have editorial policies, of course, in the media organizations. So
Right.
if we actually go and converge, you have the telecoms and you have, Dwayne was actually implying that editorial controls might be in the Telstra or somewhere else.
Yeah, okay.
So that's where I'm coming from.
Sorry, panel now. So who's making the content and who's guaranteeing its quality?
I'm generally a kind of light on content regulation kind of guy, so I don't push hard for that kind of stuff. There's I think we heard from Garrett this morning the importance of the licensing model for the development of radio. This is an area I want to look into more. I've heard about this recently on a couple of occasions. So, this idea of licensing the content out for multiple uses, the idea has been floated in this country here by scholar Peter Thompson about kind of a levy on all internet service providers or something like this that is a possibility for building up a fund that would allow for quality content to be made, a properly funded TVNZ whose purpose is to be a public service broadcaster versus a money spinner for the Treasury. These kinds of things would be helpful.
Richard, do you have a view coming from a content regulator's business?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of things to say. I think one is that the would-be distributors, the IP-based distributors of content, are at the moment, I think, just thinking of buying it from the people who already do it, or buying the people who make it themselves. So the sort of current structure of how things are made and who makes them, setting aside user-generated content, which is a separate issue, may not change that much. As for quality or standards of some kind, there is a certain amount of content regulation in Australia, and what its future is clearly a matter for debate. At the moment, free-to-air broadcasters have their own codes of practice, classification schemes, children's programming certain times of the day, all that kind of stuff. And the ACMA has a role in effectively investigating complaints about breaches of those codes, which are generated by the industry themselves. Those codes don't apply to YouTube or any new media distribution of content. The broadcasters argue that this is a disgraceful and outrageous unlevel playing field, and there's a live debate in the country about whether there should be an attempt to regulate everyone else as well, or deregulate the free-to-air broadcasters, or what? I mean, these are not simple questions. there are also suggestions that there should be an attempt to somehow get money from places like YouTube and Google to support local production industries. How that would be done remains to be seen. But clearly there isn't a loud voice for saying there should no longer be any support for Australian production of Australian content. The loud voices are arguing about how it's done and who pays for it and how it's distributed and so on. At the moment, there are various ways that it's done. And one argument is that there should simply be public subsidy direct to production, which is done in some European countries, as opposed to quotas. For example, we have on free-to-air television in Australia, they have to broadcast 55% local Australian content. No other broadcast platforms have such an obligation.
One of the interesting things in Canada is that Google is actually playing an increasing role in broadcasting policy. So if you look at a number of, because right now the traditional broadcasters want to put a stake through the heart of people like Google and Netflix and so on, or dragoon them under the Broadcasting Act, which in Canada would mean changing their ownership structure, meeting all sorts of quotas and stuff. Very unworkable. So it's basically a way of saying to get lost. But Google's made some very interesting submissions, and they say, like, look, we're hosting a ton of content. We provide channels for the CBC, has its own channel. We share advertising revenue with these channel providers. I don't know how much that is, and so on, but it's not a non-starter. There's something going on in there, and that Google is actually playing a role, as is Apple. I mean, I was shocked. I mean, 2010, 2011. Very prominent role within some important broadcast new media hearings, and they're not off the wall. We don't want to pay for your content and that kind of stuff. We're providing you with this great exhibition medium, and there is some advertising revenue being played there, and then the channels themselves is an effective way of of maintaining brand identity, so to speak. So.
Did you have something, Antony, or you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of perennial issue in Europe, certainly. A few years ago, we had a sort of big fight over this in Europe around a thing called the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which was kind of trying to draw this line between, is there a rebalancing between regulation between broadcast and kind of online? That time round, really the online debate won out. There was a real sense that you couldn't force further regulation onto the internet, and there was a bit of a lightening of some of the broadcast regulation. I have a feeling we're about to go through that again, particularly as the connected TV. I mean, what was quite clear a few years ago was that consumers had different expectations for regulation from broadcast and from the internet. They saw them as different things. I think when we get into large formats, the internet merging with broadcast on the TV, I think that's going to lead to the old questions coming back, and they might not be as easy to answer as they were sort of 4 or 5 years ago. So I think it's going to be a big issue.
Yeah, I think that's our research indicated a similar divergence of view. People had very different expectations from broadcast television from what they were viewing on the internet. But another interesting thing was that they had expectations associated with brands, so to speak, so that the content that they were getting from established, well-known big players, they had certain expectations of, which were quite different from user-generated content and things like that. So it wasn't platform they were interested in so much, or that they looked to for guidance as to what their expectations ought to be. It was where it was coming from.
So you're suggesting that, in fact, the role of a programmer as it exists in the TV world could exist in the online world because the programmer is the brand. You rely upon the brand to say this content is probably going to be good, so I'll give it a go.
Yes, but there's another question too then when you're thinking when you think in terms of broadcast television, you know, at least in Australia, when something's on, is classified in a certain way or on at a certain time of the day, that it's going to be suitable for your children or not. And that becomes more complicated when you're looking at when you're just watching things whenever you want them, chosen from all over the place on your connected TV. But people definitely want that guidance and that information, so it's a challenge for the industry and for regulators to work out a way of continuing to be able to provide that.
If it's not UGC, if it's part of the brand, you can in fact make that part of your brand.
Yeah.
Great clarity around the same stuff that the self-regulatory code does today about what you're about to see will make your eyes bleed or not. Yeah. I had another question over here, which I'll go to now.
Yeah, actually, this is Robert Pepper.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't see
No,
that.
that's okay. So a couple of things going back to the, well, before I do that, I would agree that the distinction between, as they said it in your linear and nonlinear television, it made no sense then, it makes less sense now. And to try to have separate regulatory regimes is going to be increasingly, I think, it will continue, but it'll be a folly. Because something is scheduled now, right? Does it mean that if it's not scheduled tomorrow, that because it at one time had been scheduled, it's still linear television? Which is exactly, of course, Antony, what they did at the commission, that if any television program had ever in its life had been scheduled as part of a broadcast, even if subsequently you'd be downloading it 12 years later, it would still be considered linear television, right? That makes no sense. But but what I wanted to do is actually come back to the Sky question in the following context. And Antony, I have a question for you. In the US, back in the early 90s, there was a proceeding that addressed market power in content by the cable television industry. And Congress passed a law that was called Cable Access Rules, which actually provided for access to content where there was a vertically integrated relationship that led to market power. It's an interesting law because, in fact, it actually, in its implementation, led to the literal, not just figurative, launch of the satellite broadcast industry that actually provides cable competition in video distribution in the US. Antony, as I recall, Ofcom in the UK looked at premier sport questions, right, and did two things. One is it prevented dominance over the electronic program guide, right, and opened that up, right, through regulation. And second, if I recall correctly, there was some intervention on content, and especially premier sport content, in terms of making it available to multiple platforms. And that may be something that could be thought about in the current context. And I don't recall all the details, but I figured you know much more since this is what you follow. Thanks.
Yeah, no, really for the first time there has been some sort of increased regulatory pressure on Sky to, in terms of how it wholesales some of its premium content. I think it's not entirely clear to me how far that's gone on how successful that's been in terms of opening up that content in a way that other operators or other providers feel it gives them something that they can go away and create a kind of competitive product with. So I think there has been some easing up, but not. I'm not sure it's kind of the end of the story really yet. I think, in some ways, I think we might be seeing a bit of a sort of changing relationship between the regulator and Sky, possibly, and I think it's an issue that we'll probably come back to. But having said that, I think there's also a sense that that maybe premium content is as I was trying to say earlier, the interesting thing about Sky's position in the UK market has been that the impact that it had on Virgin Media, because Virgin Media sort of for years tried to battle with Sky. They really fought over content because they were trying to get sort of more advantageous kind of access to Sky's content so they could retail it at a competitive level. They eventually gave up and said, well, actually, our USP here is our broadband capability. And that actually had a hugely positive impact on the UK market when they stopped fighting with Sky and they got on with what they were good at, which was delivering broadband. And that's had a really positive impact on the whole market. So in a bizarre way, you sort of think, well, maybe it was maybe it is quite good to have one player that's sort of focused on the delivery of the kind of premium content, if that means that other people play to other strengths. The thing I think would be a concern would be if you felt that somehow that single dominant player was kind of locking down relationships with the other players in the marketplace, because that seems to be sort of a restriction of kind of competitive pressure going forward.
Dwayne, did you Ross?
Just in relation to my distinction between video on demand and other services, under the New Zealand regime, video on demand is a telecommunications service. Linear TV is broadcasting. And so, although I'm happy to comment on video on demand, broadcasting is completely outside my jurisdiction.
Right. Well, you're sitting beside a converged regulator, though he's converged only between broadcasting and telecommunications, but doesn't have the economics bit, but our convergence review wants him to have the economics bit. Would you prefer to be him or you?
I prefer to be me, I think.
We can perhaps explore that later a little bit. Let me ask a slightly more direct question within the purview of the Commerce Commission. Gerd, in his opening remarks, said something along the lines of there ought to be a law that if you've got content, you've got to make it available. Now, that sounds awfully like an access regime to me. That if you've got content and I want to be able to show it, there's got to be a way by which I can get you to provide it to me. It's no different to star stakes and fencing wire. I can't build my fence if I can't get the star posts. We invented access regimes to deal with that. American legislation already has the ability for competition courts to actually make access judgments. Australian and New Zealand courts don't. Do you think there's scope for the idea of access regulation in the content sphere?
That's a policy decision, so it's not for me as a regulator to express a view on that particular subject. Nice try.
Okay, I've got a question at the back.
My name is Jordan Carter, and I'm just speaking with my own personal opinion here at the moment. That interchange between you and Ross about the role of the Commerce Commission in these markets and the lack of a converged regulator, I think, highlights one of the key problems that this whole conference is actually raising. The fact that there isn't anyone who's responsible for taking a joined-up look across these markets. And I wondered if any of the panel members, I don't think Ross can answer this one, would care to offer a perspective about whether you think that solving that lack of regulatory convergence in New Zealand is a part of making this UFB investment worthwhile.
Can I slightly rephrase the question on your behalf to make it not necessarily regulatory oversight but policy oversight? I mean, we recognise that regulators aren't necessarily policy agencies, but certainly who've got to focus on the outcomes across the sectors. And Antony?
Yeah, I was going to say almost exactly the same thing. I think it's not just the regulator here; it's also government as well. And I think there are real challenges for governments and government departments. We all know how siloed kind of governments tend to be in terms of their policy making. And I think there's real challenges for governments around the world to kind of come to terms with the whole breadth of issues around convergence. You start throwing in issues like security, issues like privacy, and so on. These are issues that span right across government. They go way beyond just the issue of economic regulation. And I think this is a massive challenge for governments. I haven't seen a government anywhere in the world that I think has really got across these issues yet. And it really works against the way in which governments operate. As I said, in the UK, we have the Home Office does kind of security stuff. We have Department for Media, Culture and Sports is doing broadband at the moment. Where did that come from, really? So we have a real problem of getting that joined upness and that converged view across government, more so than the regulator in the UK.
Richard, you're a converged regulator without the economic regulation.
Well, without the competition responsibility. So the question is, where should competition in content, regulation of competition in content lie? Should it be within a communications portfolio, communications regulator, or should it be in an economy-wide competition regulator in Australia? Should it belong to Department of Communications or the Attorney General or the Department of Finance? These are open questions. At the moment, there's a particular, one of the issues being addressed in the debate about classification, the review of classification of content, is whether that really is a communications issue and not an Attorney General's issue, for example. At least the debate is happening. These are political matters, and as Antony says, there's an extraordinary range of issues, from privacy to classification to everything else, and they're not all going to end up in the communications portfolio in any government, and they're not all going to end up in the communications and media regulator to administer the policy. But it seems unlikely. But there are certainly good arguments for more of them being together in a communications policy environment and administrative environment than currently exists, it seems to me.
Yeah, okay. And Dwayne, did you have a view on this one?
I'll just be quick and just say, I think the Comcast decision is actually a very interesting place to go take a look, because just like Robert Pepper was saying, going back to the cable access rules, I can't remember what they were in the 90s, but the Comcast decision gives a nice kind of reprise of that history and gives you the kind of landmark cases between 98 and 2011, which basically says, hey, we've dealt with access to content for a number of times. This has been absolutely fundamental to our policy of encouraging the development of new distribution networks. And that was one of the points that I was trying to make. So I think, it really is important to deal with this content side of things because of the impact it's going to have on the development of the network. And my big concern, reading through the situation here in New Zealand, is that by tying the networks up around such a limited range of programming offers, you really take the competitive spur out of the networks. I mean, when free TV started up in France, it kicked some serious ass, and it drove France Telecom to invest like some serious coin into its network, and so it was a real spur to competition. And why? Because it was able to get access to content. And the FCC in that Comcast decision is crystal clear. And I put that one slide up for you, is just to show you that. We see this as essential to the success of our national broadband plan. So.
And Ross, you're going to take the opportunity not to say anything?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, I've got can I see the hands up for people who want to speak? And I'll just see if I can get person down here, person here, person here. So that'd be the order of three. Can you, this one here? Gentleman on the aisle.
Thanks. I was inspired by the movies from ACMA.
The ACMA?
Yeah.
The chair will get very angry with you.
I think the idea of converging the media regulatory body with the equivalent of a commissioning agency is a brilliant step. I'd like to see the movies that Ross has really got in him in New Zealand. So just to lighten it up a little bit, I was thinking in my head it would be quite good to have a movie warning young people about the arrival of FBI-driven search warrants in the middle of the night if they actually happen to try and access a little bit of open content on their own. And I was also wondering just what other movies do the panellists think need to be made to bring the digital natives into line with appropriate behaviour. Cheers.
I'll leave to the others what other movies might be in the pipeline, but we held a forum called a Young Citizens Forum not very long ago in Sydney, and it was quite striking. We had people like me and a whole lot of people interested in the subject, and some real live young people as well on the panel, and who were 15, 17, 18 years old, and it was quite interesting, not that surprising to some of us, but how quite clear and explicit the young people were about accessing video material online, and this whole concept of it being forbidden, just forget it. The horse has bolted, you guys are on another planet. There was just no debate amongst the kids about that they were breaking the law and should stop and might go to jail. It was laughable.
Well, they wouldn't go to jail.
Some people do. They wouldn't.
No, it's not, breach of copyright's not theft under the Criminal Act, is it? Breach of copyright's not theft under the Crimes Act?
It is if it's on a commercial scale.
If it's on a commercial scale. Antony, you look like you had something to say.
Just coming back to the video point, security. I mean, I do actually think there's a real issue around raising consumer awareness of just how to stay secure, how to keep your data secure. That every day we become, a more connected society, and every day we become a more vulnerable society just because of that. And the some of the long-term implications, I think, of this sheer level of connectivity that modern societies have. I think it's going to be important for everybody to understand just, there's always a weakest link, and at the moment I think that weakest link is often with the consumer in terms of just how they stay secure. So to add that to the list of things to make a sort of informing video about, that would be on my list.
The comment I had that I think is particularly relevant around that last piece of Richard's was the idea of the active citizen. So much about media now is about active choice as opposed to simply sitting back and watching. And where the ACMA has been going in part has been to say, well, let's recognise that it's an active participant, not just a passive participant, so they can control more things themselves. And I think that's partly where that's going, because the old world view of that would have been, of course, to start writing rules about what, you couldn't be an under 18-year-old and be allowed to post video onto the net. Well, no, we're not saying that. We're saying, we want you to learn about the consequences. It's there for training purposes. It's there for educational purposes. I think it's a really interesting piece of regulator moving into if we think the market can look after this, or individuals can look after this, let's empower the individual, as opposed to the old world view of let's make a law that stops it. Is that roughly where you've been going?
Absolutely. It's quite clear to me that sort of black letter regulation is going to become increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to apply. And our role has got to be in arming citizens to protect themselves.
There's an interesting example of that in Korea, where internet gambling is a major problem, and they have passed laws prohibiting, I think, children under the age of 18 from playing online gaming between the hours of maybe 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Highly unsuccessful, but
whereas perhaps you need to educate people about the dangers of gambling. Now then, we had two down here, which you're going to finish on.
Thank you. Peter Thompson, Victoria University. Thanks very much to the panel for a fascinating discussion of a range of really important issues. Something I'd like to pick up on is some questions about the nature of competition. Because it seems to me that there's a lot of mythologies embedded in different policy paradigms about the nature of markets, and I thank Dwayne in particular for unpacking some of those. Within New Zealand, of course, there's a certain hierarchy of ministerial portfolios. I mean, Treasury sets the broad fiscal parameters of what's possible. MED's been the big economic driver of the broadband initiative. Ministry for Culture and Heritage obviously makes claims on that that inflect it in ways that are socially, culturally useful. But you can't always do what we might see as useful for citizens when you're trying to optimise what you see as beneficial to the economy as a whole. And I think that leads to some dangerous assumptions, such as the assumption that simply if you have the technology, you're going to get the content, a point I made earlier. I think there's also mythologies about the nature of competition, and this is where I'd like some comments from the panel. How do you actually measure competition? How do you know when you've got it? How do you know when it's healthy? How do you know when you've not got it? And if I'm allowed, in a sense, is there a need to really unpack the idea of what we mean by competition if we're going to avoid equating competition with deregulation, or assuming that just simply because you've got more than one provider, you've got competition? Because I think those are assumptions that are particularly applicable in the New Zealand case. Thank you.
Ross, better start with that really small topic.
Yeah. Look, we measure it really in consumer choice, quality of service, prices, and if you compare the situation in 2006 to the situation today, you see consumer choice is far greater, prices have dropped, quality is far higher, and that's continuing day by day and week by week. So I think you measure the effect of competition from the point of view of the end user. What's their choice, what's available? And we've seen remarkable progress, and I'm not as pessimistic as Dwayne about the state of competition in this market. In fact, I think there's 4 or 5 ISPs that are major players, a lot of niche players, all very effective competitors. So I'm not at all disheartened about the level of concentration.
And Dwayne is the next point call for this one.
Yeah, what to say? I think first of all, it's necessary to get a good fix on trends over time. That's what I was saying to, I think it's Bronwyn, her name Bronwyn, over here. So, we need to kind of evaluate trends over time. And, we needn't be kind of starry-eyed about, competition, what competition is going to be in a, it's going to be 1,000 flowers blooming kind of thing, right? But you do need to be able to have significant enough competition that they are not going to do what I was focusing on here, flying in flocks, right? When you see, the big 4 flying in flocks, you got trouble, right? When they're flying in flocks on price, on bandwidth caps, and in the biggie, tying themselves to, a single source of programming, that's a problem. I mean, I would, if you had 3 providers here, right? 3 providers, that would still be off the scales in terms of an HHI score, Herfindahl index score, right? But, so what? If they were, 3 providers that had 3 distinctive kind of offerings, bundled, video services with different internet plans and, some with or without caps, or, caps that were far more generous, right? The pricing dispersion, then that would be fine, and and then to kind of watch that over time, I think would be, and how each of them behaved. If you had one of them that was like a kind of an open access video platform, right, and did that, I think would be, so it really depends on watching the behavior.
Did you have something?
Yeah, I think you have to focus on the outcomes. You've got to look at the outcomes, and you've got to, and then work backwards from there. I think that really plays to Dwayne's point. I mean, data. I mean, we had exactly the same problem trying to put that data together about, simply trying to work out what services are available in different markets. Why is it hard to find that data? I think transparency across markets, helps you evaluate the outcomes, and that can inform smarter, more informed regulation. Every market's different. Every country is going to, and every regulator and every, they're going to find their own way to solving this one. Every market has got different strengths and weaknesses, and some of it will be by design, and some of it will be by chance. Things happen in the marketplace that go one way or the other. But yeah, you've got to look at the outcomes. You need to be able to benchmark yourself against what's happening in other countries. So encourage transparency and then work backwards from there.
Whilst I've got you, I did want to have a question for you earlier, which I didn't get to, and since I've got a bit of time, I'm going to take my prerogative. The reason I drew the attention to the distinction between a sort of a one-to-many and a many-to-many model, for me, is also how it feeds into S-shaped diffusion curves. Why is an S-shaped diffusion curve S-shaped? There's a range of reasons for that. But one of them is that you are influenced by other people. Whether I buy something or not can be a factor of how many other people have already bought it. If a product's got a high network effect, that becomes more prevalent. So if something like high speed broadband is a bit more dependent upon how many other people have got it, because some of the things I want to do require a new ecosystem to evolve, which was largely there in the case of lower speed broadband, then it's not unusual to expect a flattened take-up rate because of that network effect taking time to kick in. Is that a possible hypothesis, or am I?
Yeah, I think that, and I think that might be. It comes back to this kind of point where the innovation kicks in and you get the next generation of services. And I think the difference this time around is that there's, for a lot of people, there's a reasonable product out there. There was a bigger difference between dial-up and broadband in terms of its functionality and its value than there is between sort of current generation and next generation, neither of which are precisely defined or relate to a particular thing. So I think hence, that early phase I think is looking flatter around the world. Now that has quite important implications, because if you're a government somewhere that's invested heavily in building out an infrastructure, and then there's going to be pressure to sort of say, well, what's the level of take-up? Has this turned into a big kind of white elephant type project? And I think it's important there to recognise that this is going to take some time to come through. We have the same thing in the UK. We've got interventions that are coming into play, and there'll be pressure to say, well, have they worked or not? And I think the point that we're trying to make is this is going to take a bit more time, and people need to be aware of that.
Okay. And I had one last question down the front here.
Thank you, Winseck, EagleCom Advisory. The topic that was discussed, led by Professor Winseck, is on the ranking, and I think the benchmarking is a fascinating topic for a lot of people, especially politicians, communication ministers, and regulators and researchers. But there's so many different ways of benchmarking and classifying, and we have, you highlight several of them today. And also the OECD got something there, which is used by communication ministers in various countries to drive their initiative and policy. But there's also the Fibre to the Home Council, the FTTH Council. And recently they released the global ranking of fibre to the home and fibre to the building. And Canada make it to the list for the first time, and South Korea is on the top. But would the panel think that such ranking would help drive demand at the user end? Because it creates the politician interest in driving their own initiative within their own countries. Thank you.
Yes. I think the rankings, they have their use, right? We shouldn't make a fetish out of them. I was trying to put the data together here, trying to get a best understanding of the New Zealand situation that I could, understand what's been happening. And I like the Berkman report. I think that Bankler has done a really good job in putting that together. And so I thought if I took one small piece of that and tried to replicate it, it would be useful. And I know it can work as a spur, when used in the political environment. So they have their use, but is there going to be a link to demand? I don't really think so. Just let me make one thing. I meant to say this before during my talk, but I wrote up a whopping big paper before I came here. That's the basis of my talk. I've sent it out around on Twitter. I'd like to encourage anybody that wants to kind of get the full deal. Take a look for the paper on Twitter, or come and see me, and I'll give you my email, and we'll arrange for a swap.
Anyone else?
I think that OECD broadband penetration report is very important in terms of government policy making. I mean, one of the major reasons given for the 2006 reforms after the 2001 reform was that New Zealand hadn't moved, it was 22nd or 23rd, right the way through that 5-year period. And one of the major reasons for the 2006 reforms was, well, we have to do something more to get the penetration up. Now, we've moved since that time from 23rd up to 18th or 17th. Australia's reversed that. We passed Australia a couple of years ago, so that's a good reason to have those alone. So it's very difficult to find some independent international benchmark, and generally if you don't do well on the benchmark, you complain about how it's compiled. The Americans have always complained about how households are defined, to say that they aren't properly recorded, but it's as good a measure as we have. But not to consumers, it's for policymakers, really.
Yeah, we have a lot of whinging in Canada amongst the industry that the measures that the OECD uses are, in some way or other flawed.
Snap. It's the same thing in Australia. It's a kickback
all the time, but I happen to know the guy from Stats Canada that helped the OECD design the measures, and they're pretty good.
That is going to conclude our time for discussion. But before we wrap, I just wanted to ask each of the panellists if they had any last observation they wish to make. You don't have to. It's an opportunity, not a requirement, on the general theme of international experiences and lessons for New Zealand. Is there anything that you wanted to say you think hasn't been elucidated in the question and answer? Antony?
I probably just had one additional thing, and there was a Twitter that came up that said HTTV, high definition television, hasn't been really relevant in Asia, and uptake's been really good there. But the reality is, if you look at Japan, for example, 12 years fibre rollout, they've got 93% penetration, 38% uptake, and they put that down to a lack of applications. So it's not as if Asia is on its own different from Europe or different from the US. It's exactly the same across the entire world where fiber's been rolled out.
There's one of my PhD students is nicely kind of intervened. I don't know how the hell he figured that out, but there's the link to my paper. Thanks, Adel.
It's quite sort of spooky having this immediate feedback from around the place. In the political sphere, it's slightly more interesting when my current boss is before estimates hearings and someone asks him a question that he doesn't quite know the answer to. He has been known to say, now, if anyone from my office is listening to this broadcast, look, I'm going to wrap there. I want you to all thank these wonderful panellists for, I think, it was a great session. But I'm not letting you go